Let's run through a basic example of form processing in Laravel. To demonstrate this, I've set up a form to create new products in our store. You can see it's got two fields, a text input for the product name and a dropdown for the category. To see how I set this up, let's go over to the code base, and starting in our web routes, I created two routes. The first route is to show the form that we were just looking at. And you can see the URL pattern for that page. It's /products/create. And this is going to invoke a create method within our products controller. Let's take a look at the code there. So here's the create method. We're returning a view I created called products-create. And I pass along some category data to it so we can pre-fill that dropdown. The way I get that category data is using our category model. And I'm using an Eloquent method called pluck, which allows us to get the data for just one single field in the corresponding table. And in this case, the data I'm interested in is the name field. And then the second argument I pass to pluck is just how it's going to be keying this data. So pluck is going to give us an array. And in this case, the keys of the array are going to be the IDs of the category, and the values are going to be the name for each category. And this is perfect because that is the data structure we need to create that dropdown that we were looking at in the form. And then the fetch method I'm using to actually execute this query is all. All right, so I get that data, I pass it to the view. Let's take a quick look at that view. All right, so here is my form, basic HTML form. Just to connect with what I was just showing with the categories, here is the dropdown. So we create a dropdown, obviously, in HTML using a select element. And then for each of the options, I generate that by setting up a blade for each loop, where I loop through that categories array that we constructed over in the controller. And I set up each category in a option element where the value is going to be the ID of the category. And then the label, or what the user sees in the dropdown, is going to be the name of the category. And just to make sure that's clear, let's go back to the page and look at the source code for the resulting dropdown. So I'm going to right click, go to view page source. And then here is that select element. So you can see each of our options has a value for the ID of the category and then the category itself. So that's our category input. Coming back, the other input is we have a basic text input for the name of the product. Let's look at the structure of the form itself. The first thing to observe is the method we're going to be submitting this form with is post. When it comes to submitting HTML forms, you can submit them either the GET request or the POST request. But anytime you're persisting data to the server, which is what we're going to be doing here, we're going to be adding products to our database. It's convention that you're going to be using the POST method there. The action is /products. And both of these things, the method and the action, corresponds to the second route we saw in our web routes file here, where you can see we're going to be listening for a post request. So unlike our other routes where we're just using get, in this instance to process our form, we're switching over to post. And then here's that URL pattern of just /products. And this is going to invoke a store method in our products controller. All right, so long story short, when you are dealing with form processing, you typically have two routes. The first route is to show the form itself, and then the second route is going to be to process the data when that form is submitted. Now, if I were to test this form out right now, it would actually fail. And let me show you that. Let's go back to the browser, back to our form, just enter some gibberish data, submit it, and we get this 419 page expired error. This happens because there is a security feature that Laravel applications have when it comes to submitting forms via post, where there's a special security token you need to include as part of your forms. And the way we can add the security token, if we go back to our form, is we're going to use a blade directive called CSRF. This is short for cross-site request forgery, which is a type of website vulnerability where some outside server or site could be trying to submit data to your server. And how this protects us from that vulnerability is this blade directive is going to input a hidden field into our form with a special token. And then what's going to happen is when we submit the form, the receiving end of that submission is going to be checking for that token and making sure it's authentic. And assuming it is, it then validates that, okay, this form request is coming from the server. It's not coming from some outside site. And just to see that in action, now that I've added this CSRF directive, let's go back to our form. I'm going to refresh it and look at the underlying page source. And if we look within our form where that CSRF directive was, we can see it created this hidden input. It's got a name of _ token, and it's got this special encrypted value. So again, when we submit this form as part of the processing of that form, it's going to be checking for this value to authenticate this request. All right, now that we've added this, if we try to submit our form again, we should no longer see an error. All right, good. We're not seeing an error. We are seeing a blank page, and that's just because I haven't filled out the method yet that is handling the form processing. All right, so long story short, if you're dealing with a form that is submitting via post, just remember to include that CSRF directive, get that token in the form, and then the processing and the checking of the token, that's all handled by Laravel behind the scenes anytime you're dealing with the post method. Now, if we were submitting this form using the HTTP GET method, we wouldn't need to include that just because typically when we're submitting forms via GET, we're not persisting data to the server. We're less concerned with external requests trying to do nefarious things. So that level of security is not included with GET submitted forms, but it is always included with post submitted forms. Moving on, let's turn our attention to the processing of this form. So remember, this form is going to be submitting to this post route. That's going to be invoking the store method within our products controller. And if we go over to that, you can see I've set up the method, but I haven't written any code in it yet. So let's fill this out. And the first thing I'm going to do is to the method itself, I'm going to pass a special request object. This object is something that Laravel makes available to any of our methods within a controller, and it's going to contain useful data and utilities for processing our request. Specifically, when it comes to form processing, any of the data that was submitted as part of the form is going to be available via this request object. To see this, let's throw in a couple dump statements. We're going to access that request object, and the first bit of data I want to get from the request is the name of the product that the user entered in our form. And to get that information, looking at the form itself, we want to look at what was the name attribute given to our inputs. So in the case of the product name, the name attribute was just name. And in the case of our dropdown, the name attribute was category ID. So that's how we're going to access our data. We've got the product name and the category ID. All right, so let's output that. So we're going to output the name, and let's also output the category ID. And you can see the syntax for that was just basically treating any of our form inputs as these dynamic properties of the request object. Let's see this in action. Going back to our form, let's submit it again. So we'll enter some gibberish data. All right, and there's our output. So that's the name we entered, and that's the ID of the category we had selected. So now that we see how we have access to this data, let's write the code to actually persist it to our products table using our product model. And then after our product is saved, we need to decide what should happen next for the user. And I think in this case, it makes sense just to redirect them back to the form. That way, if they wanted to add new products, they could. The way we're going to do that is we're going to return a invocation of Laravel's redirect method. And we'll specify the path we want to redirect them back to, which in this case, it's going to be back to products create. And let's get rid of our dump statements and test this out. So I'll enter a product name, choose a category, submit our form, and it seems like it worked. It did redirect us back to our products create page, which is what we wanted. Obviously, from a user's perspective, it's a little unclear what happened because we didn't have any sort of confirmation. I'll address that in a moment, but let's make sure that our product was actually added. So I'm going to go over to our products page. I'm going to filter down by tech, and perfect, there's the product that we just added. So with that confirmed working, let's address that confusion that happens when we just send the user back to the create page with no sort of confirmation. What I'm going to do as part of this redirect, I want to send along a message that we can output, letting the user know that their product was added. And I can do that by chaining onto this redirect method, a method called with, and I could specify a key for some data I want to send along. So in this case, I'm just going to call it message. And then the second argument is going to be the message itself. So we'll just say something like your product was added. And let's go ahead and inject the name of the product that was added. All right, now with that set up, let's go over to our view where we need to check and see if a message was passed. And if it is, we want to output it to the page. And I'll go ahead and do this at the bottom of the form. I'm going to output the message, and the way I'm going to access the message is using a built-in helper called session. And then we keyed it by message, so that's what we're going to use for our argument we passed a session. Now this will work when we've submitted the form because we should have a message in the session, but when we first go to this page and the form hasn't been submitted, we won't actually have a message yet, and this will create an error. So to prevent that, I'm just going to wrap this in an if statement. And we're just going to check and see if we actually have a message in the session, in which case we will output it. Otherwise, nothing will happen. Let's test this. So coming back to our form, we'll again add a new product, submit it, and perfect. There's our confirmation message below our form. Now note, if I refresh this page, I'm not going to see that confirmation message anymore, because when we are sending data like we did here with the with method as part of a redirect, it's doing what's referred to as flashing. It's flashing it to the session. And what that means is it's only going to be available for a single page request. So if we come back to this page in the future, we refresh it, anything like that, that message is no longer available. And that's perfect for something like this because we only need to show that message once after the form submission. It's not something that we need to continually show. To wrap up this form, one more thing I'd like to add is some validation. And Laravel has a bunch of form validation features built right in that make this process very simple. To access these features, the first thing we're going to do is we are going to reference our request object, and we're going to call this validate method on it. Then to this method, we're going to pass an array of fields that we want to validate. So for example, if we want to validate our name field, we can indicate which validation rules we want to apply. And there's a lot of validation rules that Laravel makes available, but just for a sampling of them, let's say that this field is required. So in other words, the user has to enter a name in order for this form to pass validation. We could add a validation rule called unique, and we could specify that the product name has to be unique amongst our products table. In other words, we can't have two products with the same name in our database. Another thing we could do is we could specify, say, a max amount of characters that the product name could be. There's so many validation rules. Pretty much anything you could possibly want to validate on in a form, Laravel has rules for it. And to the extent that they don't, you can create your own custom validation rules. So that's all we have to do to trigger the validation system. And what's going to happen is if our form does not pass these rules that we have specified, the rest of the code in this method will not be executed. Instead, what will happen is it'll redirect the user back where they came from. So back to our page where we're showing the form itself. And at that point, we would want to output any of the validation errors that were produced so the user knows what the problem is, they can fix the errors. So let's do that in our products create view. We'll put this after our form before the confirmation message. We'll put some code here to output any errors. And to get this code, rather than typing it out, I'm going to go over to the notes that accompany this video. And let's go down to the section at the end on validation. And here's some standard error output code we can include. So I'll copy that, bring it in, and paste it. And what this code is doing is it's taking advantage of this global errors variable that is made available to all of our views. And this variable will contain information about any errors that are produced as part of the validation system. So here we're just checking if we have any errors, and then if we do have any errors, we loop through them and display each error as part of this unordered list. So let's see this in action. Coming back to our form, I'm going to submit it, but I'm not going to enter a product name. And we can see the output of our error. So in this case, we triggered that required validation rule. For one of our other rules, let's enter a product that's already in our database. And there we can see the appropriate error output for that. All right, so that's validation in a nutshell, as well as form processing in a nutshell. And along the way, we got to explore a little bit more with our Eloquent models in terms of persisting data to the database. So in the next video, I want to wrap up the series and do a recap of what we learned and talk about where you should go next as you continue down your path of learning to work with Laravel.